Oakwood was a small, quiet town tucked away in the rolling hills of Massachusetts. The town had always been a peaceful place, a haven for families who sought a simple life. It was the type of place where everyone knew each other, where neighbors looked out for one another. But there was one part of the town that most people avoided: Oakwood Cemetery. The cemetery had been around for centuries, its tombstones weathered and covered in ivy, many of them worn down to the point of illegibility. Some said the cemetery was built over ancient burial grounds, while others believed that the restless spirits of the dead had never truly left. Over the years, strange rumors had circulated about the cemetery. People claimed to hear whispers on windy nights and see shadowy figures lurking between the gravestones. But for all the ghost stories, no one had ever dared to venture into the cemetery at night until Jake. Jake was a 24-year-old man who had recently moved to Oakwood to work as a community service volunteer at a local mosque. He was tall, with short black hair, and an athletic build that made him stand out. Jake wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories or supernatural occurrences. He had always been skeptical of such things, preferring to focus on the practical aspects of life. But that would change one fateful night in 2021. For the past 39 days, Jake had been participating in a religious retreat, staying at the mosque and performing his prayers. The retreat was part of a spiritual journey to improve his connection with his faith, and Jake had been following the rules to the letter. He prayed 5 times a day, followed the diet, and stayed away from distractions. He was deeply involved in the community, and his fellow worshipers respected him for his dedication. But on the 39th night of his retreat, something within Jake stirred. The idea of the paranormal had always intrigued him, and he had heard plenty of rumors about Oakwood Cemetery. The thought of visiting the cemetery had been on his mind for some time, but he had always pushed it aside, convinced that there was no truth to the stories. That night, however, the pull was irresistible. Tomorrow, my 40 days will be up, Jake thought to himself. After that, I'll leave Oakwood and return home. But tonight I want to see for myself. He had heard stories from the older members of the mosque about strange happenings at the cemetery. They spoke of the restless spirits of long-dead townsfolk, of eerie voices and flickering lights in the darkness. But Jake was skeptical. It's all just superstitions, he told himself. Around 1:30 a.m., Jake slipped out of the mosque and made his way toward Oakwood Cemetery. The air was cool, the sky clear and full of stars. As he walked through the quiet streets, he couldn't shake the sense that he was doing something forbidden. Still, he pressed on. The cemetery was only a few blocks away, and he knew it would be empty at this hour. When he arrived at the cemetery gates, he paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the old tombstones standing like sentinels in the moonlight. The cemetery was eerily silent, with no sounds of wildlife or the usual rustle of trees. It felt as though the world had fallen still. Jake entered the cemetery and began to explore. He wandered between the gravestones, reading the inscriptions on the weathered stones. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. As he ventured deeper into the cemetery, he noticed a large stone bench in the center of the graveyard. It was surrounded by a ring of ancient trees, their branches hanging low. He sat down on the bench, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over him. The cemetery was quiet, almost unnaturally so. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, just a deep, heavy silence that made his thoughts feel muffled. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through Instagram, trying to pass the time. Half an hour passed, and nothing unusual occurred. Jake sat there, feeling slightly foolish. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "There's nothing here, just a bunch of old gravestones." Just as he was about to get up and leave, a strange sensation washed over him. It was as if the atmosphere in the cemetery had shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He stood up, his heart racing for no apparent reason. The feeling of being watched lingered, but when he turned around, there was no one there. Still, he shook off the feeling. "I'm being paranoid," he told himself. "There's nothing here." But just as he was about to leave, a soft, almost inaudible whisper caught his attention. It was so faint that he couldn't make out the words, but it seemed to come from behind him. Jake spun around, but the cemetery was as empty as ever. His pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He felt his stomach tighten with unease, but he refused to acknowledge it. "It's just the wind," he thought, trying to reassure himself. He left the cemetery quickly, making his way back to the mosque. His footsteps echoed in the quiet night, but the unsettling feeling lingered. When he finally arrived at the mosque, he tried to shake off the experience. Nothing had happened after all. He had simply let his imagination get the best of him. The next day, Jake went about his usual routine. He prayed, ate, and spent time with the other members of the mosque. But as the day went on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The days following Jake's visit to Oakwood Cemetery seemed normal on the surface. He woke up each morning, performed his prayers, and attended to his daily duties at the mosque. Yet, there was something deeply unsettling about his nights. The unease he had felt in the cemetery had begun to creep into his everyday life. It wasn't something he could easily ignore, but he couldn't quite place his finger on what was wrong. Every corner of his room felt like it was being watched, and he could never shake the feeling that someone or something was close behind him. One evening, as he sat down to dinner with the other men from the mosque, Jake noticed something strange. His friend, Adam, who had joined the retreat with him, looked unusually tense. His eyes darted around the room, and he kept glancing nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. Jake chalked it up to stress or fatigue. But when Adam suddenly asked him if he had been to the cemetery recently, a chill ran down Jake's spine. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, trying to remain casual. "You've been to Oakwood Cemetery, right?" Adam's voice was low, his gaze shifting to the door as if he didn't want anyone to overhear. "I'm not sure if I should tell you this, but I've heard things. Strange things." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had been trying to avoid thinking about the cemetery, but hearing Adam mention it stirred up memories of that night. "What kind of things?" Jake asked, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. "I don't know," Adam replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "People around here, they say strange things happen to anyone who spends too long in the cemetery. I heard about someone who went in and came out with a strange mark on their neck. Others say they saw shadows following them back home. But there's one thing they all agree on: no one comes back the same." Jake felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Was it possible that what he had experienced in the cemetery was real? Was there something in that place, something malevolent, that was now following him? As the days passed, the strange occurrences in the mosque intensified. It started with subtle things. Objects in Jake's room being moved around when he was sure he hadn't touched them. Shadows darting out of the corner of his vision, whispers in the dark. It wasn't just Jake anymore. His fellow volunteers were starting to notice it too. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Jake was woken by the sound of someone knocking on his door. He opened it to find his roommate, Sam, looking pale and wide-eyed. "I can't sleep," Sam said, his voice trembling. "There's something in my room. It keeps calling my name." Jake immediately felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but deep down, he already knew the answer. "I don't know," Sam replied, his voice shaking. "I keep hearing it. It sounds like my mom. But when I look, no one's there. It's like someone's whispering from the shadows." Jake's heart raced. It sounded eerily familiar to what he had experienced the night he left the cemetery. He tried to reassure Sam, but he could see the fear in his eyes. That night, Jake lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was around 2 a.m. when it happened again. Jake heard the whispers, faint at first, as though they were coming from far away. But then they grew louder, They were coming from outside his room. His heart pounded as he stood up and crept to the door, carefully listening. The whispering was clearer now. It wasn't Sam or anyone from the mosque. It sounded like a woman's voice, speaking in soft, unintelligible words. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty. He stepped out, heart racing, and slowly walked down the hall toward the source of the whispers. The sound was coming from the kitchen. He hesitated for a moment, but then, driven by curiosity and fear, he approached the room. As he turned the corner, the kitchen lights flickered. He froze. The room was empty, but the whispers continued. He could feel his skin crawl as if invisible hands were brushing against him. The air grew thick with dread, and Jake's mind raced. The whispers stopped abruptly, and then came a soft, almost childlike giggle. Jake's eyes went wide, and before he could react, he felt a cold, icy wind rush past him. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was no one there. His mind was reeling. What was happening? Was it his imagination? Or had something from the cemetery followed him back? Jake knew one thing for certain. Something had changed. The cemetery had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't explain. The next day, Jake tried to act normal, but his anxiety only increased. When he returned to his room that evening, he found his belongings scattered across the floor. His clothes were pulled from his drawers and piled in a corner, his books overturned on the desk. But the strangest thing was the small, folded note he found under his pillow. It read, "We are waiting for you." Jake's blood ran cold. He had not shared any of his experiences with anyone. No one knew about his visit to the cemetery, so how could anyone have known? That night, his sleep was fitful, plagued by disturbing dreams. He dreamt of the cemetery, the gravestones rising up around him, the whispering voices growing louder. He could see shadows moving between the tombs, their eyes glowing with malice. He tried to run, but no matter how fast he moved, the shadows were always right behind him. He woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. The room was silent, but the unease never left. He knew now that the cemetery was not just a place for the dead, it was a place where something else resided, something that followed him back to the mosque. The following days were a blur for Jake. His mind was clouded with confusion, fear, and an overwhelming sense that something was horribly wrong. It was as if he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. No matter how much he tried to push the thoughts aside, the events that had unfolded after his visit to the cemetery continued to haunt him. His friends at the mosque noticed his unease. Adam, the one who had mentioned the strange rumors about the cemetery, approached him one evening after dinner. "Jake, I don't know what's going on with you, but you've changed. You look different, like something's eating at you." Jake forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine," he said, though the lie felt heavy on his tongue. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something or someone was observing him from the shadows. The nights grew worse. Every time Jake tried to sleep, the whispers returned, filling the room with their chilling voices. He would hear them when he tried to close his eyes, soft murmurs just out of reach of understanding. At first, they were faint, but over time, they grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be calling his name. One night, Jake couldn't take it any longer. He decided to confront whatever it was that had followed him back from the cemetery. He knew he couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. He had to face the truth. There was something in the mosque, something tied to his visit to Oakwood Cemetery. But what could it be? And why had it latched onto him? Around midnight, Jake left his room and quietly slipped out of the mosque. He walked through the empty streets of Oakwood, his breath visible in the cold night air. His destination was clear the cemetery. This time, he needed answers. As he approached the cemetery gates, Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The cemetery looked different now, as though it was alive with a dark energy that pulsed beneath the ground. The moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the tombstones. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, broken only by the sound of Jake's footsteps on the gravel path. He entered the cemetery once again, his heart racing in his chest. This time, he wasn't just curious, he was desperate. He needed to understand why this place had chosen him, why it had followed him home. Jake walked deeper into the cemetery, the gravestones looming over him like silent witnesses. The whispers returned, this time louder, almost as if they were surrounding him. He stopped in front of a particularly old tombstone, its surface cracked and weathered with age. The name was nearly unreadable, but the date carved into the stone was unmistakable, 1823. It was then that Jake noticed something strange. There, beneath the tombstone, was a small, almost hidden hole in the ground. It wasn't natural. Someone had dug it out recently. Against his better judgment, Jake knelt down and peered inside. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. Inside the hole were old bones, fragments of a long, dead body, wrapped in what looked like tattered cloth. But the most unsettling thing was the presence that lingered in the air. It felt as though the earth itself was alive, holding something back, something dangerous. Jake's mind raced as he stood up, backing away from the hole. "This isn't right," he muttered to himself. "What the hell did I get myself into?" Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of voices. They surrounded him, calling his name, pleading with him. "You've awakened us," one voice hissed. "You cannot leave now." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the air grew colder, and the cemetery seemed to close in around him. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, moving like figures, but when he turned to look, they were gone. His legs felt weak, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He tried to run, but his feet felt heavy, as though the ground itself was pulling him back. In the distance, Jake saw a figure standing between two gravestones. It was tall and indistinct, shrouded in shadow. He couldn't make out its face, but he could feel its presence strong, ancient, and full of malice. The figure seemed to beckon to him, and against his better judgment, Jake took a step forward. As he approached, the figure slowly turned and disappeared behind the gravestones. But before he could follow, something grabbed his ankle. It was cold, unnaturally so, and it felt as though it was pulling him down into the earth. Jake screamed in terror, trying to pull away, but the grip was too strong. It was as if the cemetery itself had come alive, holding him captive. He struggled, but his body felt heavier with every passing second. Desperation surged within him. He had to get out. He had to leave before whatever was in that cemetery consumed him completely. With all the strength he could muster, Jake pulled free from the unseen grip and ran. He didn't look back. He didn't care how fast he was running. He just needed to escape. His breath was ragged, his pulse thundering in his ears. The cemetery seemed to stretch on endlessly, its tombstones towering above him, casting long, terrifying shadows. As he reached the gates, Jake didn't stop. He didn't pause to look back or to catch his breath. He just ran out of the cemetery, down the street, back to the safety of the mosque. He burst through the doors, heart pounding in his chest. The whispering voices had stopped, but the feeling of being followed had not. He could still feel their eyes on him, could still hear their whispers just beyond the edge of his hearing. Jake collapsed onto the floor of his room, drenched in sweat, his body trembling. He was too afraid to sleep, too afraid to even move. It felt as though something was watching him, waiting for the moment when he would let his guard down. The next morning, Jake's friends found him pale and shaken. They asked if he was okay, but he couldn't bring himself to tell them the truth. How could he explain what had happened? How could he tell them that something in that cemetery had followed him back? That something was waiting for him to slip up, to let his guard down? It was then that Father Matthew, The local priest, who had been called in to help other townspeople with strange occurrences, arrived at the mosque. He had heard about Jake's troubled state and offered to perform a ritual to help rid him of whatever it was that had followed him. Jake, desperate for a solution, agreed. Father Matthew led Jake into a quiet room and began chanting prayers. His voice was steady, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavy with each word. As the priest's chants grew louder, Jake felt a strange sensation rise in his chest. It was as if something was being pulled out of him, something dark and cold. Suddenly, Jake felt a rush of energy. The whispers stopped, the oppressive weight lifted, and the air grew warm again. The sensation of being watched vanished, and for the first time in days, he could breathe freely. Father Matthew finished his prayer, and Jake collapsed into a chair, exhausted but relieved. He had survived. The haunting was over, or so he thought. Weeks later, Jake still couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. He had escaped the cemetery's curse, but he knew deep down that some things couldn't be undone. Some places leave marks on the soul that never fade. He swore to never return to Oakwood Cemetery, but he couldn't forget what had happened there. And though the whispers had ceased, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, waiting for the day when they would call him back.